Okay, well, thanks for completing that survey. Hopefully, you didn't start the day by lying in church. You shouldn't do that. Full confession, what kind of waiter am I? If I'm at a light, I am inching forward. At the same time, I'm looking at the countdown on the opposite crosswalk, and I'm looking to the next light to see if I'm going to catch a green, if I can hit it. Okay, so I clearly have issues when it comes to waiting. Now, I was thinking about this that waiting for something that you know is going to happen and something good that you know is going to happen, it's not really that hard. Right? Like mostly what you need for waiting for something that's really good that you know is coming, it's eventual, it's guaranteed. You just need some patience, maybe and a little self control. Like you just wait for Christmas morning, right? It's coming. You're waiting, for a birthday party that's coming or a trip that you've planned and paid for and it's booked. And it's just a matter of time, maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. Maybe you're waiting for a child to come and and all of the signs are showing and it's eventual. And I'm not by any stretch, don't misquote me, okay? I did not say it's easy to be pregnant, but the waiting, it's just a period of time it's coming. That you just need patience for that. But then there's times when we're waiting for something that could go either way, right? A job that we applied for, a school that we applied to get into, maybe for a relationship to come along or a relationship to get better. Maybe for the tests of a health result, of a test result for a family member, or something that you're hoping for good news, but it may not be good news, and so that's hard to wait when you're in that place. And then maybe the hardest kind of waiting is when it feels like what we're waiting for is just never going to happen. When it maybe feels like this is past the point of no return. This is so far too late. When what we are waiting for has been too long in coming, and maybe we've even given up on the possibility, but the longing is not gone. And those are the hardest times to wait. And if I can say this, in those places, right, when we're waiting for something that could go either way, or for something that feels like we've been waiting way too long, that maybe seems like an impossibility now, that's when we are susceptible to frustration, anger, maybe numbing out, maybe addiction, maybe despair or something coming in, bitterness into our hearts because we've been waiting and we're probably not sure it's going to happen or we've been waiting too long. What we need in times and seasons like that is something more than patience. We need hope. We need hope when we're waiting. And I bring this up because we are in a season, and actually you've already heard a reading today about hope, and that is in the Advent season. Advent is the 4 weeks, the 30 days, if you will, leading up to Christmas Eve or the arrival of Christmas. That's what the word Advent means, arrival. And it is a season where we set aside to prepare ourselves, in a sense, to receive every good gift that God has to give us. But not just as kind of remembering that Jesus arrived 2,000 years ago, and that's what we celebrated Christmas. Christmas isn't a memorializing of something that simply happened in history. It is a realizing and remembering, in the Advent season in particular, saying that Christ arrives still in our church gatherings, by his Spirit, in our hearts, in our lives, in our minds, in our relationships, that he is here by his presence, and we have to prepare ourselves to be able to receive him. One of the things we say every year at Advent is, hey, we just don't want you to have this experience on Christmas Eve. You're like, oh my gosh, Christmas is tomorrow? I totally forgot. I wasn't even thinking about it. We want to actually prepare ourselves so that you don't miss anything that God has for you. And in the Advent season, it is a season that remembers or anticipates that we are waiting for, not just for Christmas, but for the arrival of Christ in our lives. Waiting, like I said, in so many different ways. Sometimes waiting for things that could go either way, good news versus bad news, or we're not sure how to take that news, or waiting for things that it feels like we've been waiting for a long time. And what our line for Advent this year is, how do you have hope when you're having to wait, right? Having hope when you're having to wait. That what would it mean to be able to, instead of being susceptible to bitterness, anger, or numbing out, or addiction, or despair coming into our lives when we're waiting for news that hasn't come yet, or maybe we've even received bad news and we're waiting for better news, how does hope begin to be the leading influence and emotion and motivation in our lives? This Advent season, we're actually going to be learning from those who had to wait for a very long time. What we're calling those who had to wait for the longest Christmas Eve ever. And by that, I mean, it was the people that whose writings we find in what Christians have called the first half of the Bible, or the Old Testament. It is the people of God, as they were waiting for a very long time for God to show up. In a sense, they didn't even know they were waiting for Christmas, but it was the longest Christmas Eve ever. Several thousand years of waiting. What were they waiting for? Well, they were waiting for God, as they were God's people, and God was their king and their leader and the one who loved them and shepherded them. They found themselves in a place where they had lost their independence, their religious identity, their ethnic identity, their social well-being. They had lost all sense of stability as the empire of Babylon had come in and crushed them. And we, make jokes about the evil empire, but seriously, the Babylonian Empire was the most powerful and cruel empire on the face of the earth. Darth Vader had nothing on King Nebuchadnezzar. That they were under the crushing heel of the Babylonian Empire that had burned their temple, burned their city, killed their kings, taken most of them out of their city of Jerusalem into Babylonia to kind of brainwash them into Babylonian culture and basically change their lives radically for the worse forever. And so the people found themselves, many of them in Babylon, some of them still in Jerusalem, in a terrible state of slavery and oppression and fear and loss. And they were waiting for God to come and rescue them. And in that season, and actually for the next kind of 400 years, God would send messengers, prophets, to actually bring them messages of hope, to remind them of things that they were tempted to forget when they were waiting for something that was hard, or waiting for better news and waiting for things that had seemed past the point of no return. And sometimes the words the prophets gave were kind of stern warnings and saying, hey, you brought some of this on yourself, or you've forgotten God, or you've neglected justice for the poor and for the marginalized while you're waiting. You're not caring for each other. But most often the prophets were meant to bring words of hope. And we're going to read today from one of those prophets, Isaiah, and we're going to be looking at different prophets throughout this whole series, from a passage that if you had joined us in the Bible reading plan a couple weeks ago as we started the Advent series on November 20th, you would have read this as the opening text. And I want to read it for you as an introduction to what hope looks like, how to have hope when we're having to wait. And something that is actually maybe the most surprising thing for me, I've read this passage many times, but as I read it this week, something that stuck out to me that I think maybe is one of the key ingredients for us to have hope while we're having to wait. Listen, it's the voice of someone shouting, clear the way through the wilderness for the Lord. Make a straight highway through the wasteland for our God. Fill in the valleys and level the mountains and hills. Straighten the curves and smooth out the rough places. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. The Lord has spoken. O Zion, messenger of good news, shout from the mountaintops. Shout it louder, O Jerusalem. Shout and do not be afraid. Tell the towns of Judah, your God is coming. Yes, the sovereign Lord is coming in power. He will rule with a powerful arm. See, he brings his reward with him as he comes. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will carry the lambs in his arms, holding them close to his heart. He will gently lead the mother sheep with their young. What I saw this time around reading through this passage is that hope needs a voice. Hope needs a voice. It also actually tells us who the voice of hope is and what the voice of hope says. And this is so important to us, I think, if I can just say this for a moment, because there are many other voices in our lives already, many of which don't bring hope, right? Like there are the voices around us. Let's just say like the media that we consume and that we watch or that we listen to on the radio or the news or whatever. And quite often that voice is not hope-filled. It is hopeless. I mean, everything is awesome does not sell and get eyeballs and clicks, right? Stories of doom and doubt and fear and hopelessness and calamity and violence and tragedy, that's what seems to sell the news. And that's what we get on a constant state across our feeds, across our notifications, wherever we look, right? The voices around us are hopeless. They deal in fear. Many of the things that you're being sold, the motivation is fear often. And so the voices that we let in our lives are very hopeful. Sometimes they're angry, sometimes they're despairing, sometimes they're bitter, complaining about the government or complaining about this or fighting each other or tearing each other down. Certainly not voices of hope. And yet we have to realize we're surrounded by those voices. But not just in the media. Many of us have voices of hopelessness around us, right? Voices of despair. Some of us came from families where the grandparents, the parents, it was just normal to complain about the world, to complain about the boss, to complain about situations, to complain about the government, to complain about the weather. Voices that bring in discouragement, anger, bitterness, fear. Some of us have voices of critique in our lives, that we are surrounded by people that don't inspire us with hope. Or perhaps even voices that discourage us in our faith. Or maybe you have a friend or a family member or sometimes even a spouse that kind of has some disdain for your faith or thinks that even if you're exploring faith, that you're a fool for even thinking about that. Maybe you're turning to God in your time of need and people are like, why would you do that, right? Sometimes those voices around us are discouraging hope, discouraging faith, discouraging positivity in our lives. So those are voices that are very real. I have to realize there's a lot of them. They're loud. And then there are voices inside of our own heads, right? Often the voice inside of our own head is not hope-filled. It is negative towards ourselves. We think, well, I'm not someone who deserves something good to be waited for, or bad things happen to me, or that's just what happens. I'm not someone deserving of blessing, or God wouldn't look my way, or God wouldn't hear my voice, or I've done things that mean I'm disqualified from God bringing good things in my life or bringing hope into my life. Or sometimes we have the voice of like, oh yeah, God can't be trusted. You can't, he worked for you in the past, but he won't now. The voice of doubt sometimes is loud in our own heads. And then, of course, the scriptures tell us that we have an enemy whose primary stratagem in our lives is words, a voice. That sometimes we can hear voices and believe, maybe literally or not, but just that are not true about doubting ourselves, tearing us down. It's a voice that tempts us towards addiction and despair and bitterness when we're waiting, and then accuses us when we fall to those temptations, right? And is constantly lying to us about the character of God or ourselves and heaping shame and guilt on us. That's the voice of the enemy. Man, friends, those voices, right? They're loud. The voices around us, the voice inside of our head, and the voice of the enemy. Hope needs a voice. And look at what the prophet says in verse 3. Shout it out loud. Listen, someone is shouting. Why is hope shouting? Because the voices of despair and fear and doubt and anger and bitterness are loud. The voices around us, the voice in the media, the voice of sometimes people in our lives, right? The voices inside of our head, the voice of the enemy is loud. Hope needs to be louder. It says, no, don't lose hope. Listen, there is a voice that is shouting for hope in your life. And look what it begins to say. It says, clear the way through the wilderness and wasteland. That's verse 3. What's the wilderness and the wasteland? I mean, it would have been obvious for people who lived kind of in desert climates or right on the edges of deserts. Babylon was on the edge of a desert, right? The place of wilderness and wasteland, a place of emptiness, a place where nothing good can grow, where all the life has dried up and gone, right? Saying, hey, in those places, pay attention. In those places of dryness and emptiness. And then verse 4, fill in the valleys and level the mountains and make the rough places smooth. What are valleys and mountains and rough places? They're obstacles. They're things that seem insurmountable, right? A valley we cannot cross, a mountain we cannot climb over, rough places that make life difficult, right? That's in those places. Hope reminds us that God shows up in those places. Even though you're in a wasteland, even though you're in a wilderness, even though you're facing a valley you can't cross, a mountain you can't move or summit, things are rough for you on this road. God shows up still, right? The voice of hope says, hey, if you make space for God, it's telling you, hey, make these places smooth. Do something where you are to seek God. If you make space for him, if you look for him, he will show up. Right? God shows up in the wilderness, in the wasteland, where we're facing mountains and valleys and in rough places. See, hope, biblical hope doesn't mean, don't worry, everything's going to work out well. It's not toxic positivity. It's not see the bright side, right? Things may not still go how you hope. The answer you're looking for may come back negatively. The good news you're hoping may not arrive, right? That's possible. But in that place, God is present. He's not dissuaded. He's not lost hope. He's not discouraged. He's not in despair. He's not bitter. He's not against you. He is with you in those hard places. That's what hope is. And the voice continues to speak. Look, verse 10, the sovereign Lord is coming with power. He will rule with a powerful arm. And man, that's what we want to hear, right? It's like, great, God's coming for me. He's going to, smash some mountains and knock some heads around and do some miracles. And he's going to be greater than the power that was around us. And man, did Israel need that, right? They were faced with the incredible oppressive power of Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar and the oppressive empire. It seemed so powerful. And they needed to know that God was more powerful. So the prophet says, look, he's coming with power. He's got power in his arms. And they're like, yes, but then look what he says he's going to do. Verse 11, he will be a shepherd that feeds the hungry and carries the weak and gently leads those who are leading others, right? It says he gently leads those who have young. In other words, he's gently leading those who are leading others. He's caring for those who others are depending on. This is what God does. This is the voice of hope. That God can show up in wilderness places, in hard places. And when he comes, he brings his gentleness and love. Friends, we need to surround ourselves with voices like that, with voices that have that kind of hope in us, that remind us God is faithful to show up. Your circumstances don't mean God can't get through the door. That his presence is actually the thing we need the most. Yes, we're waiting for positive outcomes. Yes, we're waiting for good news. Yes, we're waiting for something that we've been longing for a long time to come around, and we can pray for that. But what we need most is God's presence in those places, having hope while we're having to wait. And we need to remember that God's power shows itself through gentleness and care and love and leading us as we are leading others. Carrying us as we are carrying others. That's how God shows up. That's the voice of hope. Friends, it cautions us, right, of listening too much to the voices of the media around us, of listening too much to some of the negativity and critique that is sometimes in our culture, in our group of friends or our family. It cautions us for listening only to the voices in our head that sometimes heap shame or doubt or fear on top of us about God and about ourselves. It cautions us against listening to the voice of the enemy or realizing that there is a voice of the enemy speaking lies into our lives about us, tempting us and then accusing us when we fall. We need voices of hope. But the second thing was something, like I said, I've read this many times. I've never seen this before. The prophet actually calls the people to be a voice of hope as well, to the community around them. He isn't just the voice. Like God calls the prophet to be a voice, but then the prophet calls the people to be a voice of hope around them. Look what he says in verse 9. O Zion, Jerusalem. He wasn't talking about the actual city. He was talking about the people. Be a messenger of good news. Shout it out. Shout hope out loud to all of the towns, the people around you. He was calling Zion and Jerusalem were the names for the people of God, right? A town, a city, an actual building doesn't have a voice. People do. He's saying, use your voice. You are messengers of good news. Bring that good news to the people around you. You have a role, God says, to be a voice of hope that shouts louder than the despair or the fear or the doubt that is so easily listened to and spoken out loud in our culture and around us. It's like the prophet is saying, or we're meant to ask, not just what voices am I listening to, but what kind of voice am I? Right? What kind of voice are we as the people of God? Right? It makes us think about, how have I been using my voice? Online, in person, in my relationships, in my school, in my workplace, in my family, in my neighborhoods, when I post, right? What kind of voice am I? And it makes me wonder, what if the church became a voice of hope in our world? What if we were known as a voice of hope? Friends, today, I don't think by and large people think that the church is a voice of hope. People think the church is a voice of critique, a voice of anger, a voice of judgment. And yet look at what the prophet says. Tell them that God's coming in power. And what kind of God is he? A God who's going to bring anger, who's going to hurt you, who's going to critique you, is a voice of judgment? No, he's going to bring his gentleness and his love and his compassion and his mercy, and he's going to lead you. What if we were voices like that, who not only spoke about God like that, but we ourselves were voices of gentleness and compassion and care and love? What if the church, the people of God, became known as voices of hope in our world? Man, that would be good news, right? And the prophet saying, Jerusalem, people of God, shout it out loud. Tell people God is good. He's coming. He hasn't forgotten you. He's showing up in these hard places. What's amazing that you kind of read in this passage and actually read all the way through the New Testament as well is that God's voice is actually heard through literal human voices. That's what he's doing. He's calling the prophet first as an individual to be a voice of hope, but then the prophet calls the people to be collective voices of hope. And it says, the Lord has spoken. God speaks through his people, to his people and to the world around us. And it is a message of hope. Look what the Apostle Paul writes years later in Ephesians 4:19. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them, right? How do we become voices of hope in the culture and the world around us? Through God's Spirit, actually. The scriptures tell us that God's Spirit gives gifts to the church, gifts of words that can speak, words of knowledge, words of encouragement, words of hope. And we have people in our church who regularly listen to God's Spirit to ask him, what does he want to say to the church? And I actually asked a few of them as I was writing this message, hey, would you be willing to listen to God on behalf of our church, on behalf of our community, and ask him what words of hope he has for us? And so you may be sitting here today and I'm just gonna have those read out for you and you're gonna hear them. And they don't know exactly who these are for, but they just know God has said, like kind of to them, hey, be a prophet. You know, mostly the prophets weren't necessarily telling the future. Certainly in the Old Testament, they were a little bit, but mostly they were calling attention to where God was at work in the present time. And that's what that prophetic gift looks like in the church now, that we call out who God is, where he's at work. We are voices of hope and encouragement. And so I want you to listen to these words that people asked God are for you. And maybe one of them is exactly for you. Maybe you're gonna feel it in your chest and you're gonna know, oh my gosh, God is speaking. Maybe you're like, I've never heard the voice of God. Let me tell you, sometimes you feel it in your chest. Your heart knows something. Sometimes you might cry and you don't know why. Someone said once you were crying in the presence of God or whatever, in the presence of worship, it's because our heart knows something that our mind hasn't figured out yet. So pay attention. Or maybe you'll hear a word and you say, this is for our church. But listen as these words of hope are spoken out, voices of hope that are dialed up, louder than the noise, louder than the negativity, louder than the accusations, louder than the media, louder than the voices of doubt, to let hope rise in your heart as you listen. Man, I hope that you heard something that is inspiring hope in you even now. That is a word, the voice of God to you, real time today, to give you hope, so that you can have hope while you're having to wait. But as we close, obviously, I want to invite you to consider this whole matter of voices in our lives on a couple of fronts. One is just to ask yourself for a moment, what voices have I been listening to? Right? What voices have I been listening to? And here's a couple of ways to think about that. What media gets a daily voice in my life? Right? Not all media is bad, but think about the stuff that you're listening to or scrolling, or the news feeds that you particularly, the channels you particularly watch, or the stations you particularly listen to. Are those voices of hope or despair and fear and doubt and negativity? Right? Just ask yourself, what media is getting daily voice? What people have an influence in my ear? What's the community? What are the people? What are the friend circle like that I surround myself with? What's the tone at my dinner table? And maybe if you're a parent, you're a part of setting that tone. What's the community or the chatter at work or at school? What voices have influence in my ears? What have I been saying to myself lately? What's the self-talk been like? Is it about doubting God? Is it about discounting yourself in the presence of God? Is it thinking that God won't show up for you? Is it thinking that you can't find God in this place? This is too dark. I've been waiting too long. Or what lies from the enemy have I been believing or listening to? Maybe you just thought, oh, that's just my voice in my own head. But you realize, no, there's an accuse. That's not me. I don't think that about God. Why am I thinking that about God? I don't think that about myself. Why am I thinking that about myself? That may be the voice of the enemy in your life. And you need to silence. You can silence those voices. You turn up the dial on hope by reading scripture, by being in worship services. This is why we sing together. We sing songs of hope, right? And we come together to gather, not neglect meeting, because we need to hear voice. The stuff you heard today from people in church, you wouldn't have heard if you weren't here. Maybe secondly, what has my voice to others in person or online sounded like lately? Right? What's my voice sounded like? Not just what am I listening to, what kind of voice am I? Is it hopeful or is it negative? Is it gentle or is it angry? Is it encouraging or is it critical? Right? If God shows his power showing up with gentleness, love, care, and encouragement, so our voices should be like that. What voice have I had lately? What tone, what content, online or in person? And then maybe lastly, who around me needs a voice of hope in their ears? Who around me needs a voice of hope in their ears? Friends, this is so important because, listen, even though 550 years after these words of Isaiah were read in Babylon, God did show up. Right? Jesus did arrive. The one they were promising, God is coming. It says, yeah, he did. It took them 550 years, but he arrived. Even though we celebrate that this Advent season, we're still waiting, aren't we? Is God's work finished on the earth yet? No. Is God's work finished in your life yet and mine? No, it's not. We still need him to show up today to bring his peace and love and gentleness and wisdom and justice. We still need hope in our lives as we are waiting for Jesus to complete the work that he started. For the new heavens, the new earth, the new creation, everything to be made new is what Jesus promised, but it's not done yet. And so we need to continue to listen to voices of hope and be voices of hope to each other and to the towns and the places and cities around us. As we close today, we get a chance to celebrate communion, the communion elements, which are a physical, tangible reminder that Jesus is still doing his work. Jesus says, as often as you eat these things, do this in remembrance of me. I'm still here. I'm still speaking. I will finish what I've started. And so we take this communion today, even though this is about the death of Jesus, we're celebrating his life in the Advent season, that hope arrives still. And so my desire, my prayer for you is that you would take communion today, the presence of Jesus right here, right now, in the middle of your waiting, in the middle of your wilderness, in the middle of your difficulty, in the middle of your uncertainty, maybe even in the middle of the bad news you just got, to know that Christ is arriving still. And when he comes, he brings